Every major outlet right now is telling you the same story. Iran's lead negotiator, Ghalibaf, resigned. IRGC is scrambling to Pakistan. The talks might resume. Maybe. Possibly. And China. China said something vague about peace and went silent. That is the story you are being told. And that story is designed to keep you focused on the wrong question. The real question is not whether Iran refused Pakistan again. Iran was always going to refuse Pakistan again. The real question is why China, the one actor with genuine leverage over Tehran, the one country buying 90% of Iran's remaining oil exports, has said absolutely nothing specific, nothing operational, nothing binding at the exact moment when a single phone call from Beijing could change the trajectory of this war. That silence is not the absence of policy. That silence is the policy. And today, I am going to walk you through exactly what it means. Let me reset the frame for you. Because you cannot understand what happened this week in Islamabad, or rather what did not happen, unless you understand the structural architecture underneath it. We are now 55 days into a war that began on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched a joint strike campaign that killed Iran's supreme leader and devastated much of the country's military and government infrastructure. Since then, we have seen Iranian retaliatory missile and drone strikes, the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a Pakistan-brokered ceasefire on April 8th, the failure of the Islamabad talks on April 12th, a U.S. naval blockade of all Iranian ports, and this week, the spectacle of a ceasefire extension with no one on the other side coherent enough to negotiate. That is your baseline. Hold it in your mind. Now, here is the thesis. What we are witnessing is not a negotiation breakdown. It is the exposure of a three-layered structural crisis inside Iran, between Washington and Islamabad, and most critically, between Beijing and everyone else. Iran's internal fracture between the IRGC and its civilian negotiators is real, but it is a symptom, not a cause. The cause is that no external power with actual leverage, and that means China, has been willing to underwrite the diplomatic process. Pakistan can host talks. Pakistan cannot guarantee outcomes. Only China can do that, because only China holds the economic lifeline that keeps what remains of the Iranian state functioning. And China has made a calculated decision to let the process drift, not to kill it, not to save it, to let it drift, because drift serves Beijing's interests in ways that resolution does not. Let me walk you through this carefully. Start with the immediate reality on the ground. As of today, April 24th, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has arrived in Islamabad. He was received by Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar and Chief of Army Staff Field Marshal Asim Munir. The White House announced that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will fly to Pakistan to meet him Saturday. On the surface, this looks like progress. Pull the lens back, and you see the scaffolding shaking. Earlier this week, reports emerged, sourced initially through Israeli Channel 12 and then partially confirmed by multiple outlets, that Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf had resigned from his role leading Iran's negotiating team. The reason given was IRGC interference. Ghalibaf was the man who sat across from J.D. Vance on April 11th in Islamabad during the first round of talks. He was considered relatively flexible among Iran's senior officials. His removal, if confirmed, signals that the hardline military faction, the IRGC commanders under General Ahmad Vahidi, operating alongside the new supreme leader Mojtaba Khamenei, has effectively vetoed the civilian diplomatic track. And here's what most people miss. This is not simply an internal power struggle. This is a structural crisis of command authority inside a state that has lost its center of gravity. The original supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in the initial strikes. His replacement, his son Mojtaba, is, according to U.S. officials quoted by Axios, barely communicating. He is not responsive to either the IRGC or the civilian leadership. The man who was supposed to coordinate between these factions, the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, Ali Larijani, was assassinated by Israel in March. His replacement, Zolgadar, is described by American intelligence as not effective. So you have a decapitated command structure, a fractured government, and a military establishment that has seized operational control but lacks the diplomatic sophistication or the mandate to negotiate a deal. That is the Iranian side of this equation. Now let us move to the structural explanation, because the Iranian fracture alone does not explain what is happening. You need to understand the leverage architecture. There are exactly three external actors who could theoretically force coherence onto Iran's decision-making: the United States, Pakistan, and China. The United States has leverage, but it is coercive leverage. The blockade, the military threat, the economic strangulation. Trump himself appears to have concluded that military force has accomplished everything it can accomplish. Axios reports that several officials close to the president drew the same conclusion. He wants out of this increasingly unpopular war and will not resume strikes until every other option has been exhausted. But coercive leverage cannot build internal consensus inside a fractured regime. You can bomb a country into negotiation. You cannot bomb it into coherence. Pakistan has proximity and credibility, but not weight. Islamabad brokered the ceasefire. It hosted the talks. It scrambled fighter jets to escort Iranian delegations. Field Marshal Asim Munir has personally engaged with every faction. But Pakistan is running a 4-day workweek to conserve fuel. Its petrol prices have surged over 40% in a single month. It is simultaneously fighting in Afghanistan. Pakistan is a mediator operating at the absolute limit of its national capacity. It can arrange meetings. It cannot compel attendance, which leaves China, and this is where the entire analysis pivots. Let me give you the structural picture. China buys up to 90% of Iran's oil exports. It signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership with Tehran in 2021. It is Iran's largest trade partner. It co-authored a 5-point peace initiative with Pakistan on March 31st, calling for an immediate end to hostilities and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Its top diplomat, Wang Yi, made 26 phone calls between the start of the war and the ceasefire. Its special envoy to the Middle East held nearly 24 meetings. In March, Beijing offered to send an envoy to mediate. And then, at the decisive moment, when the Islamabad talks collapsed, when the blockade went into effect, when Iran's government fractured, when the ceasefire began to crumble, China went quiet. Not silent as in absent, silent as in strategically non-committal. The exact words matter here. When Xi Jinping spoke to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on Monday, the Chinese readout said Beijing supports all efforts conducive to restoring peace and called for the Strait of Hormuz to maintain normal passage. It did not name the United States. It did not name Iran. It did not propose a specific mechanism. It did not offer guarantees. It did not threaten consequences. Now let me walk you through the historical pattern, because this is not the first time Beijing has played this exact game. Pull the lens back to 2023. China brokered the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It was a genuine diplomatic achievement. Beijing took credit for it publicly, loudly, and used it to position itself as a responsible global power. But that deal had a specific structural feature. It cost China nothing. It required no economic commitment, no security guarantee, no enforcement mechanism. China mediated, signed the photo op, and left the implementation to the regional actors. Now contrast that with the current situation. Underwriting a peace deal in the Iran war would require China to do something it has never been willing to do in the Middle East: put its own economic and strategic capital on the line. It would mean pressuring Iran, its strategic partner, to accept terms that include nuclear constraints, limits on missile programs, and the reopening of a waterway that Tehran views as its primary strategic leverage. It would mean guaranteeing to Washington that those terms would be enforced, which would make Beijing responsible for Iranian compliance. And it would mean risking its relationship with Tehran at a moment when the IRGC, the faction least interested in compromise, is in control. This is what I call the leverage without liability architecture. China wants to be seen as a peacemaker. It does not want to bear the cost of peace. It wants influence in the post-war reconstruction without responsibility for the war's resolution. And the way you achieve that is through calibrated silence at the decisive moment. You make 26 phone calls during the buildup. You co-author peace proposals with Pakistan. You position yourself as the reasonable superpower while the Americans blockade ports and threaten civilizational destruction. And then, when the moment arrives that requires you to actually spend political capital, to call Mojtaba Khamenei and tell him to get his generals in line, to tell the IRGC that continued obstruction will jeopardize the 25-year partnership, to offer Tehran a face-saving package that makes negotiation possible, you go quiet. Because the mess serves you. Let me expand the scope here, because the implications of this go far beyond Iran. What we are watching is a live demonstration of the emerging global order's deepest structural flaw. The United States has the military capacity to start wars and impose blockades, but it increasingly lacks the diplomatic patience and institutional continuity to resolve them. Pakistan has the geographic position and diplomatic credibility to host negotiations, but it lacks the economic and strategic weight to guarantee outcomes. And China has the economic leverage and strategic relationships to broker genuine resolution, but it is calculated that doing so would cost more than benefiting from the drift. This produces what I would call a resolution vacuum, a structural condition where every actor with power has an incentive to avoid the final step. Washington wants a deal but cannot build one inside a fractured regime it just bombed. Islamabad wants peace but cannot sustain mediation while its own economy buckles. Beijing wants influence but not accountability. And inside Iran, the IRGC wants to survive, the civilian negotiators want a deal they are no longer empowered to make, and the supreme leader is, by multiple accounts, not communicating. The ceasefire holds, for now, not because anyone agreed to maintain it, but because every side is waiting for someone else to move first. Trump extended it because striking again is politically costly and strategically redundant. Iran has not resumed large-scale operations because it cannot survive the blockade economically, and China has done exactly enough to remain relevant and exactly little enough to avoid responsibility. Now let me tell you what this means, because the meaning is not in the headline, the meaning is in the structure. If this pattern holds, and I believe it will hold for the foreseeable future, then we are entering a period I would describe as managed stalemate without resolution. The blockade continues. Oil prices stay volatile, Brent hovering between $103 and $107 a barrel, still 50% higher than before the war. Iran's economy contracts further under the dual pressure of the US blockade and the Strait closure. Pakistan's mediation role becomes increasingly symbolic as the underlying power dynamics resist its efforts. And China consolidates its position for the day after, because that is what Beijing is truly focused on. Not the war, not the ceasefire, not the negotiation, the reconstruction. China is thinking about who controls the contracts when the rubble is cleared, who rebuilds Iranian infrastructure, who secures long-term energy agreements at discounted rates with a devastated and desperate Tehran, who emerges as the indispensable economic partner in a rebuilt Middle East. Al Jazeera's own analysis this week quoted Gedalia Afterman, head of the Asia-Israel Policy Program at the Abba Eban Institute, saying it precisely, China is thinking about the day after, the reconstruction efforts, renewed economic activities, renewed investment. China wants to be in a very good position on both sides of the Gulf. That is the game, not peace. Position, not resolution. Leverage for later. And this connects to a deeper civilizational pattern that I think is critical to understand. We have seen this before. Great powers that profit from the aftermath of wars they chose not to prevent. The United States itself did this in both world wars, entering late, profiting from Reconstruction, emerging as the dominant power precisely because it let the existing order exhaust itself first. What China is doing in the Middle East today is structurally identical. It is waiting. Not out of indifference, out of strategy, out of a cold, patient, historically informed calculation that the longer this war grinds on without resolution, the weaker every other actor becomes relative to Beijing. The Ghalibaf resignation, whether confirmed or not, is a signal flare from inside a collapsing decision-making structure. IRGC's trip to Islamabad is a gesture, not a breakthrough. Witkoff and Kushner flying to Pakistan is theater dressed as diplomacy until someone in the room has the authority to say yes and the power to enforce it. And China's silence is the sound of a great power deciding that the world's pain is, for now, its gain. So here's the closing turn. If you are watching this to understand the news cycle, you now have the facts. Ghalibaf reportedly out, IRGC in Islamabad, Witkoff and Kushner en route, ceasefire extended but fragile, blockade tightening. But if you are watching this to understand the architecture beneath the news, the incentives, the leverage systems, the historical rhythms, then you understand something far more important. The most powerful move being made right now is not being made by anyone at the negotiating table. It is being made by the actor that is not at the table. And in geopolitics, the actor who shapes outcomes from outside the room almost always pays less and gains more than those who sit inside it. Watch China. Not for what it says, for what it does not say, for what it does not do, for the deals it does not broker today so that it can extract a higher price tomorrow. That is the structure. That is the game. And that is what every serious observer of this conflict should be tracking from this point forward. If this analysis reframed your understanding, subscribe. Not because I am asking for engagement, but because the next phase of this conflict, the question of who actually brokers the end and at what price, will be decided in the next 72 hours to 2 weeks, and you need to be watching when it happens. Add this channel to your watch list. The structural picture is moving faster than the headlines, and what you do not see coming is always more dangerous than what you do. I will see you in the next one.